Observatory. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jessica Samuel today, who is speaking here for our fourth event of the CLAS Spring Lecture Series. Her talk is titled American Madness, Virgin Lands, National Parks, and Colonial Myths. American Madness also describes very well what is going on today. So for those of you joining us on the live stream, please submit any questions or comments via the YouTube chat section. So Dr. Jessica Samuel is an educator, interdisciplinary scholar, and decolonial activist whose work focuses on race, education, colonialism, and the environment, including where they all might converge in the United States and Caribbean. She's the founder and CEO of Radical Education and Advocacy League, LLC, REAL, a decolonial education organization focused on helping BIPOC students thrive rather than just survive. Her work has been supported by the Social Welfare History Project, Mellon Foundation, Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, and Social Science Research Council. Her writing has appeared in publications such as Environmental History Now, Environment and History, and the History Workshop Online. Dr. Samuel holds a PhD in American Studies from Boston University, a Master of Education from the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and a double bachelor's in African American Studies and Anthropology from Wesleyan University. Currently, Dr. Samuel has an appointment as a Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of African and African American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis, where she's working on her first book manuscript based on her dissertation entitled Possessive Conservation: How American Myths Haunt Educational Aims on St. John. And just recently, she's the recipient of Washington University's 2025 Maya Angelou Postdoctoral Award for Excellence in Leadership. Without further ado, we'll hear from Dr. Samuel.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Professor Wolf. It is quite a pleasure to be here with you all in not so sunny California, but we shall carry on. Before I begin my lecture, which is entitled American Madness, Virgin Lands, National Parks, and Colonial Myths, I'd like to take a moment to thank Stanford University Center for Latin American Studies, also known as CLAS, for this invitation to participate in this year's lecture series. I'd like to extend special thanks to all the individuals who helped to bring me here today, namely Mikhail Wolf, Elizabeth Saenz Ackerman, Samantha Cosentino, and various others, presumably working behind the scenes to make today possible. I appreciate all the tireless tasks I know you each do individually and as a collective to make this center a vibrant hub for intellectual exchange. So thank you. The last and actually first time that I was on Stanford's campus, I was but a 15-year-old teenager spending her summer here learning constitutional law and debating other nerdy high schoolers. We were all participants of a now dissolved, unfortunately, Junior Statesmen of America, a nonprofit youth organization with a mission to prepare students across the country, territories included, for active and well-informed civic leadership. It was the first time in my life that I had shared space with such a large number of highly ambitious and deeply passionate young people who hailed from all corners of the US empire. There were American Samoans, DMVers, Californians, Georgians, Puerto Ricans, and of course, a not so insignificant delegation of Virgin Islanders, hailing from none other than America's paradise. Most of us had been members of our local JSA chapters back at home, And others of us were simply carrying out our parents' mandate that we go do something constructive with our summers. At the time, I was a rising junior at what continues to be the only high school on my island. That I was able to travel over 3,000 miles from the tiny Virgin Island of St. John to Palo Alto, California, was in no small part due to the networks of wealth and power connected to my school and island. My participation in JSA's summer enrichment program attested not to my family's socioeconomic standing per se, but instead to the privileges of connection and resources afforded to me as a student of the island's predominant private school. Through a combination of local grants and private donations, this once upon a time island girl made it to Stanford. Now, this is not to say that my own intellect, hard work, and motivation played no part. It is just to be clear that on their own, those things were going to fly me from a small place in the Caribbean to such a huge campus on the Western border. Today, I returned to this campus for the first time since that summer back in 2007, not only as a first-generation high school graduate, but also as a first-generation college graduate, first-generation master's degree holder, and as only the second person in my immediate family to obtain a PhD. Shout out to my big sis, Dr. Gilder Guy, for being the first. I do not share this context in order to evoke any kind of bootstrap sentimentality, but instead to point to the very real ways money can move mountains. Mine's is a story of how access to educational opportunities is reinforced by networks of power that help determine where you go, how fast you get there, and whether or not you can stay. More than that, however, mine's is also a micro story of how a small place can manage to produce disparate realities for the people who call it home. St. John is the smallest of the major US Virgin Islands, which also consists of St. Thomas and St. Croix. And yet its political economy is arguably the most complex. Though it currently boasts a population of just under 4,000 people, less than 5% of the territory's population, St. John has the highest income per capita, highest median household income, and an average home sale price of well over $1 million. At the same time, 14% of households on the island report incomes below the poverty line. There exists no public high school on the island, no hospital, no airport, no comprehensive public recreational facility, and an only intermittently accessible public library. St. John's is a maddening reality, a place of many contradictions. These contradictions can disorient a local island girl, make her feel like she's hallucinating. Do I really live in America's paradise? Or is this some palm French version of hell? Does my island sit in bounty or on the bones of the pillaged dead? How can a people so divided constantly find themselves together in bed? Mighty yet disempowered, forceful yet forgotten. Indeed, St. John is a mad thing, emblematizing the most chaotic and discombobulating features of an American empire without any foreseeable end. But how exactly did a place of only 20 square miles manage to become this conundrum? Who is to be credited for its vast economic wealth, yet immense social lack? What is to blame for its renowned fame as a vacation destination and virtual oblivion as a place where local people struggle to stay in possession of their land? To paraphrase one friend from back home, is it still paradise if locals can't afford to live there? It is widely accepted that St. John's trajectory changed for good after December 1st, 1956, the date of the opening ceremony for the Virgin Islands National Park. With an initial donation of 5,086 acres of land, Lawrence Rockefeller, grandson of America's first billionaire, John D. Rockefeller, joined forces with the National Park Service, its officials, and various federal legislatures to establish the territory's first conservation site. St. John's was a pristine beauty that both enamored and inspired Rockefeller to develop an environmental program on the island similar to those he had created in Wyoming, Puerto Rico, and elsewhere across the United States through his family's nonprofit, Jackson Hole Preserve Incorporated. The often recited tale of Rockefeller's introduction to St. John suggests that he had fallen in love with the island through a chance visit while cruising the region with his wife in 1952. However, scholars such as Crystal Fort Wangler delineate a different story, wherein Rockefeller had long known of St. John's potential at least several months prior to his visit in 1952. Other writers, such as Edward O'Neill, date his interest in the island as early back as 1939. Though the archives have yet to confirm this earlier date, what remains consistent across accounts is the fact that Rockefeller's legendary chance visit was not so random after all. At the time, he was actively scoping out suitable islands in the Caribbean for his grand eco-tourist agenda. St. John's landscape proved ideal for the marriage of two of Rockefeller's longtime interests, commerce and conservation. So much so that by the end of 1952, Rockefeller had purchased the Colonial Bay Resort as part of his environmental plan. The property, once owned by the West Indian Company, now belonged to the billionaire conservationist. December 1st, 1956, then marked not only the grand opening of the Virgin Islands National Park, but also that of its appendage eco project, Colonial Bay Resort. The Virgin Islands National Park, in tandem with Colonial Bay, promised to attract millions of visitors to the quaint island and to transform St. John's once agrarian economy into a bustling tourism mecca. Indeed, the travel and creation potential of the Virgin Islands, their foremost industry, will mean continued economic growth in the years ahead. And this means opportunities for everyone, Rockefeller explained at the address. An occasion steeped in a sense of national pride and dedication to nature's bounty, the establishment of the country's 29th national park marked a turning point in St. John's history and culture. More than that, however, the Virgin Islands National Park was the crystallization of American conservationist thinking that had come to characterize the modern-day mission of the National Park Service. In the midst of the complexities of modern life, with all its pressures, the spirit of man needs more and more to refresh itself by communion with unspoiled nature, Rockefeller insisted. We need more and more the serene relaxation that only the peace and timeless beauty of our heritage can bring. Notwithstanding the reductive everyone and our laced throughout his speech, Rockefeller's discourse regarding the purpose of St. John's National Park harkens to early Romanticist claims of conservation's purpose and dovetails neatly with the National Park Service's mission that privileges enjoyment and inspiration as the proper use of such precious land. Implied in his call to tranquility is a notion that an over-industrialized, fast-paced modern society is depleting to man's consciousness and well-being, that the pressures of the hyper-capitalist projects in which everyone presumably participates necessitates uses of the environment that can remedy its soul-crushing effects. On the surface, this purpose seems plausible. even noble, perhaps, except for the fact that at the time of the park's formation, most of St. John's 800 and something residents had been living without paved roads, electricity, and fresh water. It is therefore difficult to conceive that the throes of modernity conjured in Rockefeller's speech latched St. John local people in the same way it did Rockefeller's imagined visitor of the island's new eco park. Some of the most basic trappings of modernity had yet to even arrive on St. John. So for local St. Johnians, the need to escape the ravages of this evolutionary epoch wherein man had fallen into moral declension did not quite compute. Plainly put, the imagined tourists of the Virgin Islands National Park did not look like Black St. Johnians. In fact, they did not look Black at all. In Black Faces, White Spaces, Carolyn Finney argues that a history of racialized enslavement, legalized segregation, and incessant discrimination within the United States strongly influenced Black American people's access to the outdoors and various public park facilities. With the Civil Rights Act of 1964 yet to be enacted, the vast majority of African Americans were actively being excluded from public spaces at the time of the Virgin Islands National Park's establishment in 1956. Thus, centering what is largely white people's experiences with modernity and white people's access to public recreational spaces, Rockefeller's premise for respite completely invisibilizes the unique and challenging circumstances of life on St. John and what those conditions might mean for how local Black people related to the natural environment and even understood its purposes. Moreover, further undermining Rockefeller's calls for the universal man's respite from the ravages of an industrialized society was his conspicuous plan to exploit St. John's unspoiled nature for his own financial gain through the Colonial Bay Resort. Yet neither Rockefeller's redemptionist vision for St. John nor his paradoxical relationship to it exists within a vacuum. In his book, Green Imperialism, Colonial Expansion, Tropical Island Edens, and the Origins of Environmentalism, Richard Grove describes the historical implications of extracting resources, in this context, both botanical and epistemological, for the advancements of European societies. As he argues, the Dutch, French, and English all saw the Caribbean as a place to work out the destructive tendencies of humanity, wherein deforestation across Europe had made the need for a distant tropical Eden all the more necessary. Here, again, was this pattern of white men exploiting things only to have to save them? Or is it saving things only to have to exploit them? Through the creation of botanical gardens across islands such as St. Vincent and Jamaica, European colonial officials fed the development of scientific knowledge back to the metropoles, all while simultaneously discrediting the place-based expertise of the indigenous communities that had long called these islands home. This extractive, or what sociologist Mimi Scheller might call consumptive relationship to the Caribbean and its environment hinges upon a dehumanization that is rooted in racist tropes that render indigenous Arawaks, Caribs, Tainos, Siboneyes, and forcibly transplanted West Africans as inferior and therefore non-expert non-humans. This negation of non-white people's humanity and thus identity as knowing beings, as Sylvia Winter and Kathleen McKittrick would argue, also manifested in the continental United States. Turning to the United States as arguably the most resilient imperial project of the West, provides the appropriate context within which to understand the coloniality of conservation practices on the Virgin Island of St. John, a territory of the American Caribbean. As the genesis of the early American conservation movement was in fact predicated on the erasure of indigenous knowledge, knowledge, dispossession of indigenous land, and displacement of indigenous people. Thus, notions of inhumanity have long been critical aspects of early efforts to create protected areas. Furthermore, constitutive to the formation of the United States was the notion of virgin lands, of terra nullius, land untouched, without any prior contact, nobody's land. Except we know that what is now known as the United States of America was in fact many people's land. Yet in American mythology, virgin lands entangled notions of wilderness to not only justify the conquest and eventual cultivation of unruly terra nullius into an Edenic promised land, but also to literally erase non-white people from the landscape. This virginification, as I call it, of land was made possible through various colonial mythological tools, settler products and symbols, if you will. Among them were the 19th century dime novels, which depicted dangerous adventures into the barbarous unknown, the Western hero, the yeoman farmer, and of course, the political rhetoric of manifest destiny. These cultural icons functioned as more than entertainment for the American public. They were inscriptions into the national consciousness of white men's divine right to land. Once it was made clear that westward expansion was coming to an end in the 19th century announcement of the closing of the frontier, anxieties about American land began to flare up and ultimately helped to inform advocacy around protecting land once thought of as inexhaustible. Which direction do you go when West is no longer an option? Lawrence Rockefeller, then, was a conduit for colonial mythology in two distinct ways. First, in his discovery of St. John, he invoked an American mythology that saw virgin land as in desperate need of American rescue. It did not matter that individuals had already lived there, nor did it matter that they might have had different versions of visions for what their island could be. They were effectively rendered invisible on and to the landscape, and thus minimally relevant to his mission. Second, Rockefeller's eco plan for St. John reanimated a discursive colonial legacy endemic to the Caribbean that had also been in development since the 19th century, wherein the island was perceived as what Scheller calls a feminized and passive nature, awaiting insemination by manly North American enterprise. St. John was an appendage of American empire since 1917, when it was transferred from the Danish to the United States, and a site of European colonization at least until 1718, when it was officially colonized by Denmark. It was trapped in a perpetual mythological loop. In Justice, Nature, and the Geography of Difference, geographer David Harvey argues that, quote, conceptions of space and time depend equally upon cultural, metaphorical, and intellectual skills, which is to say that the very conceptualization of the land, its definition and its purpose, is necessarily framed by the identities of the people who engage it. He posits that diverse values instantiate in nature, and that any search for an environmental ethic necessarily evokes cultural politics. In other words, there is no divorcing our subjectivities from our land-based projects. In fact, doing so only obscures the acute ways in which projects like conservation tend to work against the interests of those who lack political power, at least westernized conservation, let's be clear here, because there are various forms of conservation that have been practiced indigenously. Indeed, quote, what many nature enthusiasts had expected it to be the smooth recital of a progressivist tale of environmental care and stewardship quickly turned into a harbinger of America's most unresolved problems of possession. Glaringly absent from the project of converting portions of St. John into a national park were the experiences and perspectives of local St. Johnians, those who were ancestral natives, as they call themselves, as we call ourselves, to the island, and had a deeply intimate relationship to the environment as descendants of slavery. In fact, according to Rockefeller's own associate at the time, Jerry Flem, the average Virgin Islander had, quote, a passive attitude towards the park at the time of its conception and formation. The promise of fueling the local economy and bettering St. John had not been fully received by local St. Johnians. Most were still concerned about what their place would be in this new eco-tourist schema, and rightfully so. Today, more than 60% of the island of St. John belongs to the Virgin Islands National Park. Consequently, more than half of St. John is white, in large part to the increased number of displaced ancestral St. Johnians no longer able to afford living on the island. Several ancestral native families have had to sue the Virgin Islands National Park for issues of land encroachment. And on at least 2 occasions, congressional legislative processes refused to include local St. John people's voice in decision-making. And while there are current plans to construct a comprehensive K-12 public school on the island, currently there's only one public school, and it's K-8, which only came after more land was ceded to the Virgin Islands National Park in a land swap and exchange agreement. Current St. John high schoolers must commute by ferry for a publicly provided education. One ancestral Virgin Islander, defined as a person who traces their heritage in the islands before US acquisition, and former educator Alvis Christian, laments this reality in an interview I conducted with him back in 2020. I asked myself, he says, how are the young people going to compete? They can't compete. They cannot compete because the federal government, and I'm going above the national park, because the national park is a subset of the Department of Interior. And the Department of Interior, and people don't realize this, we the people of the Virgin Islands are under the Department of Interior, also owns the park. But the park has more say because the secretary of the park is in the president's cabinet. Who we have? A delegate to Congress that can't vote? It's little things like that. We have to realize that we haven't grown politically. We haven't grown. At this stage, I don't know about other territories, but I'm talking about the Virgin Islands. At this stage, you still have persons that can't vote for the President of the United States. That's absurd. That's absurd. The establishment of the Virgin Islands National Park, marked by its construction within the white American male imaginary of preservation, penetration, and profit, helped to both reproduce and exaggerate the already contentious dynamics of power on St. John, in particular, and the Virgin Islands more broadly. St. John people are effectively possessed, living in a state of constant madness. In her dissertation titled Possession, an ethnographic phenomenology of American colonialism in St. John, U.S. Virgin Islands, Dr. Hadia Soor, and fellow Virgin Islander, explores possession as both a constitutive construct and process that frames the lived experience of St. John people. As she puts it, quote, possession describes the subjective consciousness between self and social death in a colonized St. John, end quote. American colonialism, she adds, relies on, quote, overt schemes of recognizable differences, end quote, which help to cement the island situation as distant other. St. John belongs to the United States, but are not full members of the United States. They are props in American tourism industry, but also obstacles to white American dreams. Where St. Johnians of color desire to live in a world of their own construction, the Virgin Islands National Park has, through its policies and practices and politics, insisted on determining the extent to which St. Johnians can self-determine. This type of impositional conservation, which rests upon a subjugated personhood as constructed through a territorial condition that curtails political representation, economic opportunity, and social access, creates what I call possessive conservation. Possessive conservation relies on the museumization of wilderness, defined as the unhinged pursuit of protecting and preserving the environment at the expense of local populations and said environment sometimes. It's driven by a desire to museumize, that is, to make untouchable nature as a means of monopolizing the natural resources of the world and thereby controlling the way racialized communities access and use said resources. Living in the same colonial genealogy of looting the cultural artifacts of distant conquered lands in Africa and elsewhere, this museumization process is historically marked by European people's paradoxical exploitation of resources as a justification for their protection. Its main features include A, the political disenfranchisement of local and/or native groups, B, the hoarding of natural resources, usually by or for white Europeans or Euro-Americans, C, erasure of indigenous and/or local people populations, ecological perspectives from environmental projects, and finally, D, the often violent displacement of local populations via land theft and/or unmitigated expansion. Each of these features, I argue, rely upon accompanying myths to exact their power over St. John. The myth of virginity, frontiers, paradise, for example, the myth of white supremacy, the myth of democracy. All support the consumptive practices of conservation sites like the Virgin Islands National Park. By erroneously rendering St. John a virgin, an allegedly democratic space, where Eurocentric environmental epistemologies work best. Because myths originate and primarily live in our imaginations with material consequences, nevertheless, they often elide the contradictions they produce. That the Virgin Islands National Park causes so much distress and has for many decades and years, in various ways, to local people and their way of life, yet still receives enthusiastic support for how much money it brings to the island, testifies not only to the madness it provokes in local people, right, literal upset, but also psychological disturbance, but also to the layers of imaginaries that support the institution and are hidden by its construction as a universal good. Martinician philosopher Malcolm Ferdinand's Colonial Inhabitation proves a useful analytic at this juncture, as it's through a rigorous exposition of the embedded colonial practices, habits, attitudes, and policies of the Virgin Islands National Park, the US National Park Service, and the Department of Interior, that the long arc of colonialism, literally and symbolically tying the territory to the mainland US, is revealed. Where on the mainland United States, national parks have mostly, not completely, erased native populations from their landscapes with the help of carceral reservations, of course. On St. John, the national park can't quite get rid of Black Virgin Islanders in the same way. There is no corner of the island necessarily to cordon off this group. No place for them to go but to the sea. And unfortunately, for the United States of America, These Black Virgin Islanders have a history of jumping off cliffs before they let colonizers convince them that their dispossession is a blessing. I think it is safe to say that we would rather go mad than let that happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samuel, for that amazing talk. So we'll just open it up to questions and thoughts and responses, both from our online participants and from in person.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciated hearing the story at the beginning of your travel to Stanford and meeting other students at the time who were coming from other parts of the U.S. empire. You mentioned America Samoa, Puerto Rico, and I'd love to hear your fellowship, how have you engaged and how you thought maybe even collaborate with people who are thinking from those spaces as well. And how are you thinking about the relation between the Virgin Islands, not only with the United States, the federal government, national parks, but also with maybe potential solidarities with those other islanders, if you will. And I'm Matt Randolph, I'm PhD attendant in history. Thank you so much for your talk.
Yes, thank you, Matt. That's a great question. So I would say two things. First is sort of how do I incorporate cross-territorial solidarity or even ideation thinking in the research itself, and what might that look like outside of it. So I would say first, this work is an evolving product from my dissertation, where I specifically look at public education. That's actually my entryway into this discourse and conversation about the environment. So I was a high school K-12 educator, working in St. Louis, Missouri at the time, which I have returned to since, and teaching predominantly Black African American students who were 90% on free or reduced lunch, right? Just to give you a sense of the demographic and the socioeconomic condition of the students I taught. And I started seeing these connections between sort of how I had understood and previously conceptualized my colonial predicament as a territorial subject through my honors thesis that I had done at Wesleyan through Mellon, and how my students were experiencing education as a system, right? And as its own type of colonial project here within the United States. And eventually one thing led to another, and I ended up in Cuba talking about education in the context of the Caribbean, and came to talk about St. John, which is where I grew up and graduated from high school. And so I started seeing, the environment as something that's deeply connected to place, right? Understandings of place, and also various social institutions that are meant to happen in place-based learning, etc. And so in trying to understand, okay, what is happening at St. John? St. John has no public high school. Students have to leave the island, cross bodies of water to get a high school education. Is this happening in other territories? Not just is it happening in other places of the Caribbean, we know that at least like in Guyana, students have to actually make cross waters of bodies for schooling too. And that's a little different of a context. I wanted to start it real local, like what about American territories might help to actually facilitate this type of disjuncture. And so in so doing, I looked at the national parks in various territories. I looked at El Yunque in Puerto Rico, and then I looked at the American Samoa National Park, these two locations, because I wanted to understand their histories of establishment, right? Did what one local St. Julian calls benevolent exploitation, right? Did a benevolent exploiter such as Lawrence Rockefeller come in without his own eco-vision and help to create the same type of conservation project? Or was it different? And what I learned was that in American Samoa, it was completely different, specifically because of their situation as American nationals and not US citizens. So many people don't know this. each US territory has a different political arrangement to the United States. Okay, not all of us are on equal footing. We are just all territorial subjects, which means that we are third class citizenship. I say third class and not second class because I think there's something deeper happening, right, within our political context. But because of that, and I think there's a long conversation around American nationals being American nationals and still able to retain sort of their indigenous roots, heritage, practices, and protections. How they were able to enter into the National Park Service agreement that they eventually created was very much self-determined, right? Their tribal leaders from the onset were like, actually, you're leasing this land, okay? You're not buying it, and you can't take it from us and then tell us it's yours in perpetuity. This is ours and will remain ours. You have to sign a lease with us that you have to renew every 99 years. At least at the time, that's what I found in the records. And there are all of these sort of like cultural and indigenous precepts and principles that are retained through how land is conserved and stewarded. And so it's very much like the National Park Service is truly a steward of their land, right? Rather than any other sort of like inverse arrangement. Now, El Yunque was different because it's not quite a national park. It's like a monument, but they're different designations. And its history is really rooted in Spanish expedition and colonization and wanting to create reserves for timber. And so there's like this long history of actual natural resource extraction that then sort of, you see Spanish colonists trying to rework and undo to the point of like the paradoxical relationship to land, right? Exploiting to then have to come back and save it. And so El Yunque sort of emerges out of that direct history of resource extraction and exhaustion that then led to protection. So we're different as far as our parks are concerned within the territorial context. So there's that. But in terms of how we understand our political condition and what organizing and solidarity crafting might look like outside of my work and research, I belong to this nonprofit organization called Right to Democracy. And the mission of this organization is to confront US colonialism. The position of Right to Democracy is to not advocate for a specific political status outcome. So, central to the debate around US territories is, should we become states? Or should we freely associate? Or should we maintain our status quo? Or should we take on a different type of political arrangement? In the case of Puerto Rico, as we know, a vast majority of Puerto Ricans are really invested in the prospects of statehood. In the Virgin Islands, that's not quite the case. And so through this organization, what we spend a lot of our time doing is really thinking through critically, how can we get first to a place where the territorial condition, that project is recognized as a colonial project, right? And that the United States confronts the racist history that created unincorporation as a political designation and status for distant lands and outlying possessions. And that from there, each territory, through its own localized processes of social and political awareness, would then determine what route is best for them. Now, I think I mentioned this to the class yesterday when we were in conversation. I do personally believe that there are some political limits to how that kind of organizing can truly proceed and progress, right? At some point, once we do get to this ideal place where the United States says, you're right, we are an empire. And what we did here, by making you all our subjects with no political representation was wrong and rooted in racist logic, right? Supreme Court logic nonetheless. And so shame on us, right? Then what? I'm very curious about sort of how, as an organization, we are collectively conceiving of the thereafter. I know that there have been, the history of self-determination discourse in the Virgin Islands is long and it's rich. And there are a number of local scholars and activists who have advocated for a range of options, but specifically have really tried to consider, what can a Virgin Islands look like outside of the grass and whole of the United States. Currently, we just reconvened our 6th Constitutional Convention, which is meant to be a political space wherein we work out and determine really the contours and context of a governing document that can be ours. We are currently governed under the 1954 Revised Organic Act. And if you know anything about organic acts, their history is rooted in territorial expansion, right? And so when the United States ventured westward and would take on and acquire new territory, organic acts were sort of the principal organizing governing documents that recognize these as prospective states. And then what would happen is a transition into complete incorporation into this nation state of the United States. And so this predicament of being under an organic act is quite emblematic of the liminal and precarious position we hold politically.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Yeah, I have a question. How will this process has affected the local culture, the local art, music, food? That this has become also a touristic attraction, or has been displaced, is ignored?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have a lot of friends and acquaintances who belong to this new or revived generation of cultural revivalists, if you will. And many of them have taken to professional and artistic interests that involve like the revival of woodworking, basket weaving, coal pot cooking, right? All of these traditional Virgin Islands activities in order to help retain culture, because that is one of the biggest issues that we find, that as we continue to become increasingly Americanized by the number of people who come to the islands and find it to be their home away from home, priorities shift and emphasis on our cultural ways, our food ways, our artistic ways, they diminish with time. But I do think that there are active, and I know that there are active efforts to help retain and revive some of those traditional art forms. In terms of how it relates to tourism, currently, so I am also a part-time vendor. My grandmother, she vends in St. Croix. So I'm born on the island of St. Croix, was born there, and I was raised between both St. Croix and St. John. So I'm all around her. Call myself a Crucian St. Johnian. And so a Crucian is what you call a person from St. Croix. Yeah, Crucian, yeah. So there's a whole vending community, right? And when I would vend with my grandmother back when I was living on the island, a lot of the conversations that would happen among my peers who were vendors was around like, how can we reclaim tourism? It's the evil that we have to live with, right? For now, at least, within this present imagination that we decided to act on. And so if we're going to be within sort of this very intense, complex, and this paradigm of like this consumptive tourism industry, how do we make it really work to our benefit? And most recent conversations have been about using tourism to really do what it should be doing in the first place, which is exposing and introducing foreigners, people who are not local to the land, to the ways of the land, the traditional ways of that place. And so people have been talking more about how all of these old cultural art forms, are dancing, like quadrille, pambula, all of these kinds of things, can actually be sites of economic generation, right, and profit, but still do the dual work of cultural retention.
This was phenomenal. I have so many questions. But can you just talk a little bit more about what the like planning infrastructure in this like spatial context looks like? Because like my research is in a very, very similar context in Dominican Republic. And obviously the planning infrastructure is very different. It sounds like the commonality is like an administration for like the tourism economy and administration for like the so-called like local economy, obviously like having two very different outcomes. But all of like the public services that you talked about at the beginning of your talk kind of alluded to a somewhat like an apartheid kind of like spatial manifestation. So I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about like what does it look like to administer like this 20 square mile land that has like these two very differential existences.
Yeah, that's so good. Good question. So St. John, because it's so small, is actually subsumed by this St. Thomas St. John district structure. Okay, so in the Virgin Islands, there are only 2 districts. In many ways, kind of to the demise of St. Johnians. I think many St. Johnians have argued that it does not serve them. One, because a lot of the data collected around us is not disaggregated to really say how we are experiencing certain social, political, and economic markers. And because of that, we actually only have one senator at large that comes from St. John. And it's fascinating because that senator at large actually needs the majority of their vote to come from St. Croix in order to really make it and have a stand a good chance of winning. And they're meant to be the senator at large. They're not St. John's senator, they just come from St. John. And that has posed a number of challenges and difficulties because, you know, how can you really bring the concerns of this very small and unique place to the forefront of the local political arena when you're actually meant to do more than that? And people's expectation of you are that you actually, that you have your hand in every island pot and are able to demonstrate an explicit allegiance to everyone, though they all are situated quite differently. Which means that many times St. John gets the short end of the stick. I think the other thing that complicates that is the fact that St. John is known, it has a very notorious reputation for being the wealthy island. Okay, and as I've outlined here, that does not fully capture the reality. Okay, so on the surface, many people are like, oh, that's the white people in my island. They say that, you know, and that's the white people in my island. You'll figure it out, right? Completely erasing the half of the island that's not white, that's not wealthy, that aren't snowbirds, part-time residents coming from the continental United States, right? Aren't $1 million real estate owners, right? Like they're there and yet they're invisible. And so I am really curious about, for my work, the ways in which St. Johnians have been and continue to be actively invisibilized and erased from their own land, right? In these various forms, through these various projects, environmental conservation being one such project, but even the conceptions and the constructions of our political system and the way that which we have incorporated or actually excluded them from representation territorial.
Yeah, I have 2 different questions. One is this distinction that you made earlier about American Samoa and then thinking about the U.S. Virgin Islands and this question of a kind of recognition of sovereignty, and really thinking about how are people being recognized in the Virgin Islands, both Afro-descendant Virgin Islanders and then also indigenous groups as well, and those groups not always being distinct and being very blended within across the island. So I'm wondering, like, are there Black Indigenous solidarities? Where does Indigenous history and like desires for connection with land come up in this work?
Yeah.
And then I'm also wondering, with the kind of work that Congresswoman Basket is doing, like within a system of exploitation, like trying to foster these ways of navigating it.
Mhm.
And I just wanted to know your thoughts around that kind of navigation of like the designation of St. Croix as and the entire island as a historic landscape, these kind of desires to work within that system that still does this kind of violence. I'm wondering about the kind of tenderness and the stickiness, and the kind of multiple fractions of people, right, who have different desired outcomes around what a kind of sovereign Virgin Island might look like.
Yeah. Thank you for those questions. I'll first begin with the last one. I think this notion of navigating exploitation is a very curious one, but one that pops up, right, on various scales, as I mentioned earlier, within the very local and micro level of specific tourist industry vendors. There is this same sort of ethic and attitude, this approach of wanting to make the best out of a not so good situation. And there's a level of practicality to that, right? And I think that practicality is rooted in two things. One is fear. And two is what I think I will just, for the purposes of right now, call like the holdover approach, right? I think the fear is rooted in what this whole talk is about, which is imagination. It's rooted in the difficulties of removing ourselves from under one very hegemonic imaginary of what we can be, what we ought to be, and then also the difficulties surrounding what it means to imagine something different, to do the work of Genesis, the work of beginning at the very beginning, right? To create something else unlike what we have encountered and have known to be true up until this point. And I think, many scholars talk about this. They talk about how self-determination is, scholars, renowned and even like local thinkers back in the Virgin Islands themselves have said this in one way or another, that self-determination as a process, as a means, as an end, is a project rooted in and contingent upon radical imagination. And so I think there's a fear of imagining because I think that there's a difficulty around the very task. So in that way, I think that for many people, it may be more convenient or reasonable to simply accept that this is the status quo. And so we gotta work with what we got, and full stop. Now, the other half of that is this sort of holdover approach, which I mentioned, this holdover politics. And I think the holdover politics is rooted perhaps similarly in some ways in fear, but I think it's also rooted in the realities of people's immediate needs needing to be met. So one of the big things that, poses as a problem for many people on a territorial level within sort of discourses around like what else except beyond the territorial status of unincorporation is this notion that very basic social needs that are already so diminished and deprived will completely disappear, right? In terms of those needs being met. So we think about the federal government, we think about Medicare, Medicaid, food stamp, SNAP, right? And how all of these social programs, which are already sort of being, are already disintegrating and being demolished in all these different ways. Education, right? Like, you know, the vast majority, a significant portion of the population of Virgin Islands rely on these federal programs. And there are no local territorial safety nets that are immediately visible and evident that can substantially replace them. And so in this moment, folks are like, look, there are grandparents who need their healthcare.
Right.
Okay. There are children that need schooling. You know, there are people who have these very immediate needs. And to pull the rug from under us is to leave an already vulnerable population quite vulnerable and put them at violent risk, some would argue. And so it is a very difficult situation to be in, because where do you go next? Right. I think some people would say revolution requires sacrifice. I got, you know, eat bread and eat hard bread and suck salad and drink water, you know? Like that part of the project of figuring it out is figuring it out.
Right.
And so you just gotta take a leap. Many would argue that. You know, many would say independence now. And I don't disagree with them necessarily. I think I lean more on the like pragmatic side, and that's only because, you know, and it's not to say these individuals don't also have these kinds of relationships and you know, connections, but there are a lot of people in my life who I know rely directly on these sorts of programs, as insufficient and deficient as they already are. And I believe in taking care of our people, right? And I believe that care sometimes is complicated, and that it happens in ways that we may not necessarily prefer, but meeting the need is most important in the moment. At the same time, I'm deeply invested in our future, our political future and the political possibilities. And I'm invested in equipping our local populace with all of the resources, knowledge, and information and access necessary to truly imagine, to dream. What I wish for Virgin Islanders is that we become dreamers, right? There's this really, and I know I'm like veering off script here in terms of keeping up this like professional academic third wall, but on Instagram, there is this really cool podcast called Grits and Eggs, and I like them a lot. And I know I'm like probably giving them fame right now for even saying this in this space. But a recent episode that I watched was about like Afro-pessimism. And not about like the Afro-pessimism that we think of necessarily in an intellectual sense, right? But really about how there is a sort of habit and pattern within our current diasporic context. Specifically, I think they were speaking within the context of the United States, right? Wherein we shut down these sorts of like seemingly outlandish ideas before we even give them a chance to percolate and to take root. And you know, the podcast host, he was like, that is, and I'm definitely paraphrasing here, a byproduct of your unwillingness to do the work, right? And so I think that some people are not invested in revolution, right? I think some people would rather just keep things simple. But I think one of the things that he says that I believe is so applicable in our context and across the diasporic context, I would argue, is that, you know, in order to get to a place where we live in the world of our preference, we have to do the work of dreaming.
Yeah. Okay,
we gotta do it. We can't escape it. And sometimes it's just easier to be comatose, you know, and it's, you know, it's just simpler to be desensitized and to turn it off and to just be a zombie. But zombies don't dream. And I want us to be fully conscious and fully awake and to lucidly dream of what our future can be. And then I think it's through the dreaming that we might actually muster the courage to act on what is possible.
I'm going to have to end the live stream right now. Before I do so, this is a little bit of swag from CLAS. We can continue the conversation in person. Anybody who wants to stay until about 3 o'clock. But I just need to make an announcement for next week's talk here at CLAS, 1:30 p.m.